Right, we now come to the next urgent question. Shadow Foreign Secretary Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I ask the International Development Minister if she will make a statement on the situation in Sudan?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Member for bringing this urgent question to the House and for ensuring that we do indeed discuss this appalling situation that we see currently in Sudan. Now, since conflict erupted between the Sudanese Armed Forces and Rapid Support Forces in April last year, Sudan's witnessed one of the world's most severe humanitarian crises. Humanitarian access continues to be deliberately blocked and atrocities are being committed on a horrific scale. The UK is at the forefront to respond to this crisis. Yesterday, at the UN Security Council, the UK condemned the horrific escalation in violence in Al Jazeera state over recent days, with the Rapid Support Forces reportedly shooting indiscriminately at civilians and committing heinous acts of sexual violence. In September, as world leaders gathered for the UN General Assembly, the UK convened an event with partners to draw international attention to conflict-related sexual violence in Sudan. That followed my visit to South Sudan, where I spoke with some of those who've been impacted by this horrific violence. And on the 12th of October, Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Edinburgh also visited the Chad-Sudan border to witness the impact of the conflict of Sudan on women and girls and shine a light on the deteriorating situation. On the 9th of October, as co-leader of the UN Human Rights Council Core Group on Sudan, the UK led efforts to extend the mandate of the independent fact-finding mission on Sudan. This mission is vital for documenting human rights abuses. And most recently, on the 18th of October, the UK led a joint statement with 10 other donors condemning the obstruction of aid and calling upon the warring parties to comply with obligations under international humanitarian law. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I also want to underline that this year the UK has provided £113.5 million in aid to support those who are fleeing violence in Sudan and those who fled to neighbouring Chad, South Sudan and Libya. Thank you.
Senator Foreign Secretary Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The war in Sudan represents the largest humanitarian crisis, largest hunger crisis and largest displacement crisis in the world, but it has been almost entirely neglected because of the crises in the Middle East and Ukraine. In the 18 months since hostilities erupted, tens of thousands have been killed, more than 10 million people displaced. Horrifically, Mr. Speaker, this winter 13 million faced death by starvation. We are witnessing a continuation of what the Janjaweed, the murderous militia now restyled as the RSF, started in Darfur 20 years ago. This is a deliberate strategy to destroy a population based on their identity. Crimes against humanity, Mr. Speaker, more than 1 million people in El Fasher, North Darfur, are at immediate risk. Britain, as a member of the Troika and through many other actions, has been active. But as penholder on Sudan at the United Nations Security Council, and with our deep Sudanese historic connections, the UK has a special responsibility to accelerate international efforts to find a solution. Events are not moving far enough or fast enough. Where is the responsibility to protect a policy endorsed by the whole United Nations in this dreadful catastrophe? What steps is the Foreign Secretary taking to ensure the international community lives up to its obligation under the responsibility to protect framework? Mr. Speaker, we have seen how contentious issues on the global stage often spill over into domestic discourse. But the debate on Sudan has been muted. There are no protests in the streets, no mass public social media campaigns. News coverage has been sporadic. The government yesterday announced that it will be match funding the Disasters Emergency Committee Middle East appeal. Can she confirm today that she will do everything she can to support the launch of a DEC appeal on Sudan as soon as possible? The British public are one of the most generous, and I'm certain that with greater awareness, many will dig deep to help, both in humanitarian terms and in calling for urgent international action. As Christmas approaches, Mr. Speaker, from the comfort of our homes, we are going to witness, in a world of plenty, the hideous spectre of mass starvation. Urgent is an understatement, Mr. Speaker. We must do more and act now.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the new government is absolutely determined not to neglect this crisis. The word he just used, Mr. Speaker, was hideous. That truly is the case. When I spoke with some of those who had come back in to South Sudan from Sudan, I learned from them, including children who had effectively had to fend for themselves for many days, wading through flooded water, barely alive, frankly, by the time that they actually got to South Sudan. And I heard from them about the need to make sure that the UK government does all that it can to stop this horrific conflict, where we see, of course, the two sides really out ultimately for themselves, most definitely not for the people of Sudan who are being held ransom because of this. Now, he asked about the situation in Al-Fasher, rightly drawing attention to that. He will know, of course, that keeping that Adre border crossing open is absolutely imperative, that we should no longer see any restrictions on aid. The border must be kept open. There shouldn't be additional impediments placed there. He talked about our special responsibility, and that is certainly one that the new UK government feels very strongly indeed. We are doing all we can within the UN and bilaterally as well to make sure that the UK is providing leadership on this horrendous situation. The Foreign Secretary, I know, has raised this repeatedly, so have I, in a whole range of different contexts, including, as I said, bilaterally and multilaterally as well. He referred to the links that the people of the UK have with Sudan, and in that regard I would just mention the fact that while he rightly said there have not been protests on the streets, there are Brits up and down our country who are working extraordinarily hard to support those in Sudan, particularly through mutual aid groups, who are some of the bravest people that I've ever spoken with, both online since I came into post, and also I spoke with some of those people in Addis Ababa. They really are incredible, providing support for their communities at such a time of need. He lastly mentioned, and I'll conclude on this, Mr. Speaker, the DEC appeal that we, as he rightly mentioned, have worked with broadcasters on to match to £10 million in relation to the Middle East. Of course, any DEC appeal is determined by broadcasters, but certainly we will do all that we can to push to make sure the support that's needed by the people of Sudan will be delivered in a far greater volume than it is currently.
Rachael Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend says that she's doing all she can, both at the UN and with bilateral partners. However, this horrendous situation is unfolding day by day. 10 million people displaced, 20,000 people killed, 33,000 people injured, and it's getting worse. So can she say exactly what she is doing and how she is deploying the UN General Assembly, particularly with us being a penholder, to ensure that we bring this horrendous situation to a close?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for asking for more specific detail on this. She is right to emphasise the magnitude of this crisis, the world's largest displacement crisis, and now also, as we see very disturbingly, the largest crisis of food insecurity in the world. Specifically when it comes to the UN General Assembly, which she asked about, we made sure that the UK convened an event with partners specifically to draw attention to conflict-related sexual violence in Sudan. I also ensured that I was working with partners to hold a meeting on the Sudanese humanitarian situation. This is something we're working on right across all of our ministerial teams within the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and rightly so.
I now call Liberal Democrat spokesperson Monica Harding. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. 25 million people urgently need assistance in Sudan. Over 10 million have been displaced from their homes. Will the Minister affirm that attaining a ceasefire in Sudan is a diplomatic priority for the UK? The UK is the penholder at the UN Security Council on Sudan and assumes the presidency of the Council from Friday. Last night, I met with the former civilian Prime Minister of Sudan, Dr. Abdallah Hamdok, who is president of the Broad Civilian Front, Tagadum, and he is pushing for safe zones for civilians. Will the UK sponsor a new Security Council resolution to include this, designating no-fly areas for aircraft and Iranian drones and upholding responsibilities under Resolution 2417? Will the government look to increase the capacity of its mission in Sudan as a practical means of support? And will the government also further increase UK humanitarian assistance, including support for the UN appeal for Sudan, which has only received half its target funding?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for an incredibly important point. First of all, she is absolutely right to underline the fact that we must see an end to hostilities. As I mentioned in my response to the Right Honourable gentleman a few moments ago, the two warring parties both appear to believe that they can win this war. They're continuing their hostilities, but the impact of that on the civilian population is extreme. As we mentioned before, the highest levels of displacement anywhere in the world, the highest levels of food insecurity. There must be an end to hostilities, and the UK government is doing all it can to advocate for that. I'm very pleased to hear that she met with the former leader from Sudan, Hamdok, from the transitional government. I have also met with representatives from Takadum, a really important civil society organisation. I met with them when I was in Addis Ababa. Their voice must be heard, and it really must be heard when it comes to the protection of refugees. We've seen so many attacks on them, on internally displaced people in Sudan, and attacks on civilians as well. We will continue to argue against that. She asked about our activity within Sudan. Well, Richard Crowder is the newly appointed head of British Office Sudan and the UK Special Representative to Sudan. He's working incredibly hard on this, as I also mentioned, are all of the ministers within the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Thank you.
Laura Kyrke-Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Minister for updating us on her work. Of course, the violence continues in part because the warring parties have their sponsors in the region, including Iran and the Gulf. Can I ask, what efforts is the government taking to work with these regional sponsors to encourage de-escalation and secure a ceasefire?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for mentioning this, and she has considerable experience in the area of humanitarian needs, and we have been extremely concerned to see the situation, for example, that was revealed within the panel of experts report in January 2024 around external engagement. Now, I have said from the dispatch box before, and I will say again, the only reason for another country to be engaged in Sudan currently is to help provide humanitarian support. That is the only reason why there should be external engagement, and we will continue to make that argument very strongly indeed.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Both front benches seem to be united in their passionate concern about this terrible conflict. Does the Minister agree that if this were happening in a conflict on the continent of Europe or in the Middle East, it would be on our national news night after night after night? Why does she think our broadcasters seem to give a second-order priority to a conflict as terrible as this?
I mean, the Right Honourable gentleman asked a really important question, and it's one that I've been really struggling with as well. Without dwelling on this, hearing from those who had been directly impacted by this crisis and the horrendous times that they had spent trying to escape the violence leads one to the conclusion that there must be more of a focus on this situation. The most appalling outcome would be that some years hence, people might look back and say, why did the international community not do more? So this government is determined to use every lever, multilateral and bilateral, to try and force change and to try and make sure the people of Sudan are protected.
Alice MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. A UN investigation found today that rape is widespread in Sudan. The accounts are horrific, yet, as we have heard, the conflict is the world's forgotten war. How will the UK use its presidency of the UN Security Council in November to ensure the crisis is no longer forgotten and the world acts, including on sexual violence in conflict?
Well, my honourable friend raises an incredibly important issue, and again, I know that she has experience in this area, and the UK government has repeatedly condemned atrocities and called out human rights violations, especially conflict-related sexual violence that's been committed by parties to the conflict. We've called that out within the UN Human Rights Council, also within the Security Council. We're also making sure that we're supporting fact-finding missions. I was very pleased that we managed to secure the support of even more countries for that UN fact-finding mission. It's incredibly important because the voices of women, girls and indeed boys as well who are being subject to sexual violence must be heard, and there cannot be impunity for this.
Ellie Chowns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The brutality of violence in Sudan, the effect on destruction of agricultural systems, trade routes has led to extreme food insecurity that we have seen. Does the honourable member share my admiration for the local emergency room organisations that are doing what they can to support local people? Can she say what she will do to ensure that international aid can get through to those actors on the ground? Because in the absence of international agencies, international forces, they're all that is there. And what will she do to ensure that aid can continue to get across from the border from Chad? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for referring to the emergency response rooms. I had a meeting with a number of those involved with those mechanisms, and what we're talking about is ordinary Sudanese people who have taken extremely brave steps to make sure that they are supporting their local communities with desperately needed humanitarian aid, food, water, other supplies that they really do need right now. I have to say, as a cooperator, a Cooperative Party MP, I believe they showed the very best of mutual aid and incredible courage at the same time. The UK is working with the UN on this because we need to make sure that those individuals are supported in the incredibly important work that they're doing. And on the subject of aid from Chad, we will continue to push to make sure that Adre border crossing is kept open and that there aren't bureaucratic and administrative obstacles to aid getting through from there. Thank you.
Steve Race.
Madam Deputy Speaker, what discussions has the government had with regional actors to bring to bear pressure on the RSF and the SAF to make sure that humanitarian access to the country is allowed to prevent the severe starvation that's ongoing at the moment?
So I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this. We've had a number of discussions with a whole number of bilateral partners, both within the region and outside it. In fact, I discussed this matter with the US aid administrator last week when I was at the World Bank annuals, but we have of course had discussions with regional actors as well, a whole number of them, particularly with countries in the Gulf, but beyond that as well. We know many of them have got relationships with individuals in Sudan, and we're really pushing for those to be utilised so that we can see that aid delivery that is so desperately needed.
Chris Law.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the UN Secretary-General yesterday warned that, and I quote, "Outside powers are fuelling the fire and intensifying the nightmare of hunger and disease for millions of people in Sudan." Now, the Minister has previously stated, and I quote, the UK could not be clearer in our language that those engaged in this conflict and enabling a proxy situation are exacerbating the humanitarian crisis. So what precise actions is the UK Government taking to prevent this involvement and to stop arms from reaching the conflict zones?
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for being of the same mind that we need to see an end to external engagement. We need to see the warring parties actually coming to the negotiating table. There's been a number of different efforts to achieve that, but sadly we have not seen both parties engaging to the extent they should have been. They must engage. We must also see civil society engaging, and we need to make sure that every single country is pushing towards that end. That's the only thing that is going to be ultimately preventing the suffering of the Sudanese people.
Steve Yam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I ask the Minister, what is the government doing to ensure that the real picture impacting on civilians in the region is well known and better known, both domestically and to the international community?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising this, because it really is important that we do get as accurate accurate as possible a picture of what is taking place, including human rights violations. We're supporting the Centre for Information Resilience, which is a research body that's gathering open source evidence about the ongoing fighting in Sudan. But as I mentioned earlier, we also pushed very hard to ensure that there was support for the UN's fact-finding mission. I was very pleased that we saw African nations backing that, a whole number of different countries backing that. We need to make sure that neutral information gathering approach is really intensified so that we get that accurate picture.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for her response? It's very clear to the House that the Minister is doing her best to try and find solutions to the questions that we're asking. The escalating violence in Sudan, Gazera State, where recent attacks by the Rapid Support Forces have reportedly led to some 124 civilian deaths, widespread atrocities, including the targeting of ethnic and religious communities. In light of these events, which have led to the displacement of some 11 million people in Sudan, how is government working with international partners to safeguard freedom of religious belief for the fleeing religiously and ethnically motivated violence? And what immediate actions have been taken to ensure access to safe passage, humanitarian aid and protection for Sudanese civilians facing persecution, especially those from vulnerable religious communities? Thank you so much.
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for raising this incredibly important issue, and one of so many tragic developments that we see in Sudan at the moment is the fact that under the previous transitional government that we referred to a few moments ago, there was actually considerable progress around freedom of religion and belief. We saw, for example, that apostasy was decriminalised, Christmas was made a national holiday for those who wish to celebrate it, and so forth. There was a lot of progress there. We have not seen so far a significant increase in specific targeting of or discrimination against any religious minorities because of their beliefs, but we will keep that very closely under review, and we are aware the broader human rights situation has clearly been very disturbingly deteriorating.